Welcome, everybody, to tonight's round table, which is really a round table, I admit this, on education at Bard College, Berlin. Now, usually these occasions are closed-shop occasions, but tonight we thought, since it's about the implementation of education and the various aspects of education, why not invite those people who are, if like, ultimately and immediately and just now, right now, affected by education. And this is why we have students in this room, which I think is indispensable and will hopefully add to the lively discussion that will follow after the presentation that we have here. This meeting tonight is part of a series, as some of you know, a series of round tables on education. This series was initiated by the previous American ambassador in this country, I was going to say in the city, but it's the entire country, by Phil Murphy, whom I saw the day before yesterday and who sends his greetings, and by Hans Weiler from Stanford, and both of them, both the diplomat and the scholar, the academic and the engaged citizen, agreed that something needs to be done and some action has to be taken in the context of education. So we've had a series of roundtable events, very small scale, not many people, no public sort of debates, but very high intensity meetings where people sort of battled it out, the various aspects. And this is the first of these roundtable occasions, if you like, at this college in the heart of Pankow. And I'm very glad to see you all here on this freezing night in this part of the city. I really appreciate your presence, I must say. This is fantastic. So tonight's event is organized by us here, Bard College Berlin, and by the American Embassy, represented by May Baptista, who will say a few words in a minute, and Martina Kohl. And I really thank the two of them, who've been loyal friends and good colleagues for many years, and I wouldn't know where we'd be without you. I really mean it by now. So our two speakers will be introduced by our Dean, Catherine Toll, in a minute. I won't do any of this because I promised to talk for something like 2 to 3 minutes. These 2 to 3 minutes are up and I'm through with my introduction. Now comes the main part, which isn't really true, and this is not my place. But when I was thinking about education in the city and the tradition of the round table, I thought that when you think about the salon, which is something just like the round table, this sitting here, one name comes to mind, and that's Rahel Varnhagen. This lady in the late 18th and early 19th century, in her salon at Gendarmenmarkt, not far from here, Straße, invited brilliant thinkers, educators, if you like, church people, politicians, military people, people from all walks of life, authors, into her home to discuss matters of political, educational, and cultural relevance. And they did this in the comfort of their home, around a table, in a setting that was open, friendly, constructive, yet open to debate and inviting a debate. And when Rahel Varnhagen's salon invited people, this had, if you like, political repercussions. This wasn't just an academic talk, and this is what this setting and this meeting is meant to do, just that. We will be talking about academia in its various manifestations and various forms, but it will be about more than just, if you like, disciplinary education in one field. And this is probably what the two of you will talk about. I'm not speculating, I'm hoping. So, to conclude, obviously by thinking about Rahel Varnhagen, I thought I'd leaf through the 10,000 letters that she left, beautifully written. Seriously, I mean, this is beautiful 18th century German. And I came across a single sentence that I'll read to you and then I'll finish. She said, 190 years ago, in 1834, wo uns auch Gaben und Natur trennt, verbindet uns Freundschaft, Einsicht, Nachsicht, Gerechtigkeit, Treue, Ehrlichkeit, wahre Bildung. So where disposition and talent divide us, and that's a given, we are divided by talent and, if you like, disposition and interests. We are united, however, by friendship and by understanding, by tolerance, justice, truth, honesty, and by the essence of all this, by true education that transcends, if you like, the disciplinary divide, that goes beyond what's taught in the classroom, something that takes education into society, into real life that makes us to who and what we are. And this is only one sentence from the many sentences that we still read in this beautiful 3-volume edition of her letters. I can only recommend, if your German is really excellent, really very, very good, please read it. It's a joy to read, it's a pleasure. And it does something that the two of you, with the help of Catherine, will battle out tonight. It really, truly, in the true sense of the word, educates you. And this is what we're here for tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Rommel. Sehr geehrter Professor Rommel, Professor Harpham, Professor Brumlik, and guests. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Our ambassador, our current ambassador, John Emerson, sends his regrets that he apologizes that he can't be here tonight, but wanted to relay that and express that the U.S. Embassy and values these higher education roundtables, and this is a way for us to build bridges to the students who are here, who have joined us to this evening, as well as to build bridges for the younger generations. So thank you all for coming here. And as Professor Rommel had mentioned, there are two main reasons why we are meeting today. One, to continue the discussion that was started back in 2010 about the goals of higher education. And of course, this is the 8th roundtable. Kudos to you. Yeah. So that's a great thing. It's the 8th one. And secondly, to celebrate the fact that ECLA Bard is now Bard College Berlin, which is great. So on behalf of the U.S. Embassy, we would like to congratulate Professor Rommel and his colleagues and all the students on the new direction this institution is taking. It makes me want to become a student again. Our cooperation with BARD within the context of the higher education roundtable discussions has been exceptionally close. The scope of the discussions we've had so far has gone beyond this current state of U.S.-German relations, but have gone on to discuss issues of inclusion and integration and access to higher education. We have looked at the challenges of education in a globalized world. We have discussed the transition from school to college in the workplace, about community colleges. We have discussed the workplace and the development of workplace, and that we've had the discussion that truthfully the graduates of today will probably have to reinvent themselves many times over throughout their career. And we have talked about overlapping purposes of higher education in the context of citizenship and the role of the liberal arts. We all know that education can really make a difference, and in particularly the humanities and liberal arts. And that kind of interdisciplinary study, for example, students here at Bard College, goes beyond the purely material aspects of our lives. Yet we have to take care that this kind of education isn't a luxury item. We know that enrollment in the humanities has declined in the United States significantly. Some statistics have shown that only 8% of today's students enroll in purely liberal arts programs, yet take that with a bit of grain of salt, because some may minor in humanities or liberal arts. However, even if the number was twice as high or twice as much, there's still a downward trend in these programs. So in these times of economic challenges, parents may advise their students or their children to study something that is much more perspective, much more concrete, that would easily pay off in terms of enrollment, for example. And in fact, just to make sure that their future is a much brighter one. That's only one side of the coin. If you don't have the teachers with a broad education who look beyond their immediate agenda, looking at the common interest of the common good, then we need to rethink that. We need to rethink and develop and implement and support these new models of institutions for liberal arts colleges and professional schools. And it's, again, an excellent way to build that bridge to satisfy the passion and to satisfy this global world that we're increasingly living in. It's institutions like Bard College that build the network beyond their home institutions and take the idea of liberal arts programs abroad. So this is the right place to discuss today's agenda, education and engagement. I should point out that we're not all just talking heads and out of higher education roundtable. We're developing TACLA, That's the Transatlantic Council on Liberal Arts, with partners, as Professor Rommel mentioned, Stanford University, the Hertie School of Governance, Lufana University Mudeburg, University College Freiburg, and of course the U.S. Embassy. We are committed to the issue and welcome other institutions to the network as well. Two of the initiators of the roundtable unfortunately could not be here. That's former Ambassador Murphy, who was here, who comes back and forth between Berlin and the U.S.
He didn't tell you, I think.
No, I didn't know. But he did buy, I don't know when he left, he said he bought a house here in Berlin.
Very nice one.
So yeah, so he goes back and forth. And of course, Professor Hans Weiler of Stanford University. And we're actually following the discussions pretty closely. And like I said, our new ambassador, John Emerson, is greatly interested in the subject as well. But he and the embassy are getting ready for Secretary Kerry's visit tomorrow and the Munich Security Conference, the 50th anniversary of the conference. So let me end these remarks by thanking Professor Harpham for joining us today as our keynote, and Professor Micha Brumlik for providing the German perspective on the issue. Professor Harpham just opened the new Muhlenberg Center last night, an interdisciplinary institute at Halle University, which is also committed to liberal arts and humanities. Finally, thank you, Professor Rommel, for hosting the event tonight, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. I'll end with one sentence that Ambassador Murphy used to say, which is, "Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit." So thank you.
Thank you very much, May. Welcome everybody, and welcome to all our guests this evening. I can't resist mentioning that this evening's discussion is also in a long tradition of this college. David will remember this, the beginning of every year we would have a discussion about what is liberal arts education before anyone began being educated in that mode. It had some odd effects and interesting consequences that we sort of discussed on a theoretical level before we actually sort of started classes and courses and so on. But I think what it proved is that it's very important to do that on occasion, to take a kind of time out from the day-to-day of teaching and learning, and actually think about what the process is that we're engaged in and why it's important. And that's why I'd like to thank very much our speakers for joining us this evening to be part of the tradition of this college as well as of the Roundtable series. I think it offers us a great opportunity to think through what we're doing here in connection with their views. I think it's safe to say that these two speakers are heroes to all of us in this room, if they wouldn't mind me describing them in a slightly primitive way. I think this is a topic that needs heroes occasionally. It needs liberal arts education needs strong defenders of its mission. And our two speakers are, in their very different ways, certainly that. So let me introduce first Professor Geoffrey Harpham. He's the director of the National Humanities Center. You all know what important work that institution does in the US and around the world. He's trained as a literary critic, originally that's his field, literature, and I think we could say that he's achieved something that many literary critics often have the ambition to do, which is to comment on ethical and political issues and engage in debates far beyond their discipline. They don't always succeed in doing this in a way that is constructive and meaningful and reaches a large audience, and I think we can say that Geoffrey Harpham is someone who has done that. He has really shown us the importance both of literature and of criticism for the wider culture and for wider ethical and political debates. So this is something that I think we're all deeply grateful to him for, as well as the fact that he is such an eloquent speaker at the present time in favor of the traditions of the humanities at a moment when they're under attack both through processes of change that are in themselves perhaps neutral, they're not meant as assaults on the traditions of the humanities, but also sometimes for ideological reasons, the traditions of the humanities are under attack, and he has very eloquently shown their importance and talked about the kinds of issues that need to be discussed in this debate, and I think raised some very interesting and unexpected points as well, not just the sorts of platitudes that one might have heard many times before. So we're looking forward very much to his talk on what kind of education we need today. So please help me welcome him to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Rommel. Thank you to the American Embassy for arranging my visit here. It's not the first time I've been to Berlin. My first time was actually in 1966. I passed through Checkpoint Charlie. And I have to say the city is much improved. It's almost inconceivably changed, and it shows that Germany has the capacity for revitalization and regeneration that is deeply, deeply impressive. And for those of you who are students at Bard College or connected with it in any way, I want to say that Bard College is one of my favorite American institutions. It is exceptionally pure instance of a liberal arts education, and if you have an opportunity to go there and you haven't done so already, I urge you to take it. It's a wonderful location, a wonderful faculty, and an extraordinarily interesting student body, even for a liberal arts college, which typically do have very interesting student bodies. I understand that I have about 20 minutes, and so I'll try to fill them in an interesting way. I want to begin by asking you to imagine two rationales for education. They're very different, but very clear and succinct. The first rationale for an education of any kind would be to prepare people to lead rich and enjoyable and productive lives and enable people to meet the manifold challenges that they will face in the course of their lives. Number one. Number two is to prepare people for the jobs that will enable the nation to be competitive in the global market. These are very, very different, as I think you can immediately see. A takes its starting point from the long-term interests of the individual student, while B, the second option, takes its starting point from the more immediate interests of others, not the student necessarily, but others, employers, including the professions, and the nation. Now, the educational system that would follow from A, to prepare people to lead enjoyable, rich, meaningful lives, would be a liberal education. That is, it's a system in which a wide range of subjects is to be studied, each for its own sake, rather than for some instrumental or vocational end. That range would include math, natural science, social science. It would also include the humanities, which would introduce people to the vast range of human achievement and invite them to claim as their own a human heritage. B, on the other hand, which is to prepare students for the jobs that will enable the nation to be competitive in a global marketplace, B would be more vocational and would be more directly satisfied by an emphasis on those disciplines that have come to be called the STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and math. So how to decide this question? What rationale should guide our thinking about education? What principles ought to guide our decision? In most European countries, thinking about secondary and post-secondary education has traditionally begun with the needs of the professions, including the academic profession. The point of schooling is to acquire the credentials that are necessary to enter professional life. In the United States, thinking about education has traditionally taken its bearings from a completely different point. Not thinking about the priorities of the professions or the nation, educational thinking derives directly from political premises. Given the nation's commitment to democracy and thus to equality of opportunity, equality of access, how should the educational system be structured? This is the way American thinking on education has traditionally proceeded. In other words, the educational system was fitted around political, and I'll even say moral commitments and beliefs about the fundamental character of the nation. The American system that I'm describing really came into focus during the 25 or 30 years following the Second World War, when thinking on education was dominated by what's come to be called the general education model. Perhaps coincidentally, this was also a time of immense general prosperity and growth and social progress, albeit very painfully achieved. Compared to the present, this is also a time of far greater social cohesion, by which I don't mean an agreement on issues, but an agreement on what the issues were. The existence of a common culture actually, I think, enabled the great social upheavals surrounding the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture. The consensus on culture, which was an intended effect of the system of general education that applied to both secondary and post-secondary education, was one of the conditions that fostered the kind of relentless self-questioning that prevailed during the 1960s. During this time, the external or vocational goals for education were treated very harshly in discourse, both official and unofficial discourse about education, as was any encroachment on the independence of colleges or universities by a business sensibility. The American tone in this respect was set by a book published about 100 years, or a little more, 100 years ago by a sociologist, Thorsten Veblen, called Higher Education in America. And he said that the result of applying a business sensibility to education would be a protracted regime of mediocrity, and dozens of other highly quotable phrases. In recent years, however, I think that business sensibility has gained a lot of ground. It's gained traction among both legislators and among some of the people who would traditionally be expected to support higher education. Economic stresses have increased anxiety about the future, the cost of education, especially in the United States, maybe not here, but the cost of education ratchets up the sense that college needs to offer a certain kind of value proposition, and the mighty force of diversity has undermined confidence that anything like a consensus view on culture can be attained at all. And all this has eroded the foundation for the liberal arts model as the model for higher education, certainly for universal education. And education itself has come to stand as the most striking instance of the dominance of economistic thinking in fields once considered to be very resistant to that thinking. There's one leading corporate executive, a man who heads one of the most successful software companies in the world, and who supports some educational initiatives, told me, he said, the next great programmer is not going to come from a liberal arts education. He told me this in the context of telling me why he was not going to be giving me any money. So I remember the sentence, but for other reasons. Well, maybe the next great programmer is not going to come from a liberal arts education, but how are we going to explain the fact that many great programmers of the past, like many of the great tech entrepreneurs, did in fact come from a liberal arts education? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg may have dropped out of college, but while they were in college and in high school, they had a liberal arts education. Jobs chose a liberal arts college, Reed College, not unlike Bard, to drop out of. He didn't drop out of Caltech or MIT, he dropped out of a liberal arts college. And he famously credited a calligraphy. I think that's true. And he very famously credited a calligraphy course that he audited at Reed College with helping him to develop the artistic sensibility that's such a key reason for the success of Apple. Others, including Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, completed 4 years at Tufts, where he got a liberal arts education. Now, tech companies and tech CEOs are not exactly my field, but I think it would be very interesting to know how many of the leading figures in that world today did not have a liberal arts education. I think it would be a strikingly small number. While we're waiting for an answer to that question, I want to consider the argument for focusing our attention on the STEM disciplines, which many are making today. What can be said to those who argue that these disciplines are so essential to security and prosperity that we simply can't waste precious educational time studying literature or history or the arts? Well, one response was provided a few years ago by Charles Vest, who has pretty good credentials in this area. He's now, I think, president of something like the National Society for Engineers, but before that, and for a number of years, he was president of MIT. Several years ago, he said that the vast challenges that face us right now require not just technical expertise, but political will. And political will can only be grounded in values. And values themselves must be anchored in what he called our vision, our worldview, our culture. In order to know how to deploy our technological expertise, that is where and on what projects, we require the very stuff of the humanities. Now that was chamber music to my humanistic ears, but it left open the possibility that we should just have some scientists, or rather some humanists around who are producing lofty statements about principles and values while the scientists do what they do best. But Vest has a response to that as well. Why, he asks, do American scientists and engineers lead the world in their fields, especially with so many countries, China, India, Singapore, Finland, Germany, others, committing vast resources to these disciplines? His explanation, he was speaking as an American to American audiences, and so maybe got very little resistance to this. His explanation was that American universities are better. In other countries, he said, universities are viewed and constructed with very narrow, highly utilitarian, technology-centered approaches. I am convinced, he said, that one comparative advantage we in the United States retain for at least a few years is that we educate our engineers in a milieu in which science and engineering education are mixed in a great stew with the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences. I am convinced that this greatly enhances the creativity and innovativeness of our graduates. In other words, a liberal education that does not focus exclusively on science actually produces better science. I think his point was that when scientists at MIT or Caltech, which are liberal arts institutions, go from classroom to classroom to classroom, they have to think in different ways. That is not just about different things, but they have to think in different ways. And when they come out of that education, they are more flexible and adaptable than they would have been if they just focused on the field of their choice. I believe that the same, in fact, is true for all disciplines. I think all disciplines, including the humanities disciplines, benefit by an education that forces people, even at the cost of their GPA, to take courses in the sciences and in mathematics. Well, you might ask, what about business? If we can manage our businesses effectively and efficiently, won't the economy benefit? Won't that rising tide lift all boats? What more could we want than general prosperity, which is the precondition for solving all of our other problems? Well, that's a pretty good question, but I think another good question is whether a strictly managerial or economistic frame of reference is likely to produce that general prosperity. There's an accumulating body of evidence that suggests that the same liberal education is likely to produce better business than an education that is limited to business. This is the view of Richard Franke, who headed the John Nuveen Company in Chicago for 22 years, when that firm was growing at an absolutely extraordinary rate. During the same period, he became one of the nation's biggest supporters of the humanities, having founded the, by now, absolutely immense Chicago Humanities Festival. He's now founding the St. Louis Humanities Festival. He's funded various professorships and humanities centers at the University of Chicago and Yale. One of the features of his leadership style at Nuveen was a regular reading group that all the senior management had to attend, where they discussed works of art and literature with the goal of developing a capacity for making qualitative judgments, the habit of justifying their positions, and also the sense of having a common investment in issues that transcended their personal concerns. As he said to me, every 5 years business changes completely, and if you don't have the capacity for critical and creative thinking, you're going to be left behind. Now, another friend of mine served on the Board of Trustees at the National Humanities Center, where I worked for many years. In his professional life, John Medlin headed Wachovia Bank. He ran it pretty well. He was named National Banker of the Year in 1991. As he told me, when he first went to work at Wachovia Bank, he was just out of the service and he thought he needed a job, went to work at a bank. And they trained him to be an accountant. They gave him an accounting course, and he worked in the accounting department. As he said, when he worked as an accountant, all he was thinking about was the books, just thinking about accounting. But then they made him head of accounting. And in that capacity, he had to think all of a sudden about interpersonal relationships and managing the little disagreements and problems that arose between people. So he was thinking about psychology, small groups. And when he was made a regional manager, he had to begin thinking about geography and natural resources and the economics of the region, just in order to figure out what role a bank might play in the development of a certain region. And when eventually he became president of the bank, his thinking had to widen once again, and he found himself thinking in philosophical, historical, and broadly cultural terms. In short, each one of his promotions marched him through the liberal arts curriculum, ending up at the humanities. And he thought that if he didn't have this capacity developed through his own liberal education to think in these terms, he wouldn't have been a good executive and probably wouldn't have been made CEO at all. He was a better banker and a better leader because he was able to think in many different ways, including the humanistic ways, as well as in economic and in managerial terms. This general insight is confirmed by a recent survey of prominent CEOs in which they were asked what kind of education they looked for in the people that they hired. what kind of education would you want in somebody that you hired? A clear majority said that they wanted employees who had had a liberal arts education with a humanities component. But even more telling was the response of those same people when they were asked what sort of education they wanted their children to have. An even clearer majority, 91%, said that they wanted their children to have a liberal education. They knew that humanities majors often have a harder time finding the first job than STEM graduates do, and that when they do, it often pays less than the jobs that STEM graduates get. But they also understood what has just been confirmed a couple of weeks ago in a study that's acquiring notoriety. By mid-career, humanities graduates have generally drawn equal in pay. And after 15 years, about half of humanities graduates are actually exceeding the pay of their STEM peers. Now, the CEOs who wanted their employees and children to have liberal educations were not poets and dilettantes. They were managers. They were business people. And they weren't saying that material success should be scorned in favor of higher values. Not at all. They were saying first that there's more to life than your job. But I think they were also saying something that Charles Vest and Richard Franke and John Medlin would agree with, that the best business people have more than business expertise, but they saw business as one aspect of human existence among others. And they were saying that an education that focused people on business rather than on education in a more general and comprehensive sense served them and the companies that they worked for very poorly. On this point, there's one last bit of testimony that I can't resist giving you. A recent interview, Stephen Breyer, who's one of the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court, spoke eloquently, at length, in detail, and in French about his love for Marcel Proust, which is most astonishing in American context. All of those, that is at length, in detail, in French, about Proust. Everything is astonishing. Breyer had studied philosophy before he turned to law, and his interviewer said, well, why did you take this delay in your professional career? Obviously a pretty good lawyer, you could have gone straight on. And he said, we're only allowed one life. It's the human condition, there's no escaping it. In my view, only by studying the humanities can we hope to escape this fundamental limitation and understand how other people live. When you're a judge, you spend your whole day in front of a computer. It's very important to imagine what other people's lives might be like, lives that your decisions will affect. People who are not only different from you, but also very different from each other. This empathy, I'm still quoting, this ability to envision the practical consequences on one's contemporaries of a law or legal decision seems to me to be a crucial quality in a judge. Now, I believe, and I think that Breyer would agree, that the ability to imagine the lives of others is a crucial quality in human life generally. In fact, if you lack it altogether, you are considered to be disabled. Education doesn't create this faculty, but it can either weaken it by treating it as a distraction or an irrelevance, or it can strengthen it through exercise. Now, the point I've been trying to make is that this is not just a choice between the short term and the long term, or between immediate needs and general human flourishing. Ultimately, I think it's a choice between a good approach to education and a bad one. If we want a society that's intellectually incurious, politically docile, historically ignorant, with people confined within the horizon of their own experience and their own direct knowledge, we can choose the path of training rather than education. We can construct an education that will transmit limited kinds of information to students rather than developing higher order cognitive skills. But if we want a society with a higher top end, composed of people who are capable of progressing beyond middle management, beyond routine and the production of the already known, a society that's curious, imaginative, and reflective, then we need an educational system that opens up capacities. I'm not suggesting everyone should have the same values and interests. We need people of all kinds. We need people to work as middle management. We need people to pick fruit, clean hotel rooms, build bridges, make cars, everything needs to be done. But we also need bankers of the year and university presidents. We need a society that's rich and diverse enough so that everyone can find their place in it and can continue to do so as the world turns. And in the view of everybody that I've quoted here, carefully selected to be sure, this richness is best achieved not by training people for currently existing jobs, which in fact I think often turns out to be the jobs that existed 5 years ago, and not by having government dictate educational priorities, but rather by educating people in a way that will enable them to make the most of their lives, whatever they determine that most to be. Paradoxically, all these people would argue, and I am here too, people will do better at their jobs and the nation will be more competitive if we do not train with these objectives in mind, if we give people the ability to meet the unexpected challenges that they'll face and lead enriched, meaningful, and not unimportant, pleasurable lives. In a recent New Yorker article, Adam Gopnik wrote about teaching English. Now, he acknowledged lots of problems in the teaching of English. Professors seem to care more about their professional status, and they teach too much theory, and morale is low, et cetera, et cetera. But then he cited the experience of his father, who was a Jewish immigrant, who read the great books at Columbia University, one of the early liberal arts innovations. And he eventually became a literature professor. Reading the great books, Gopnik said, was both inspiring and democratizing. But he concluded this article with a more general statement, which I find so interesting. We can't, he said, just be born and produce and consume services and goods in the most efficient possible way and die. That can't be it. There has to be something else, and he capitalized something else. Something else, I think, is often found in the domain of the humanities. It's arts, it's history, it's philosophy, it's some kind of reflection on the human experience, human achievement, the things that our species is capable of, for better or for worse. It's a something commensurate to our big brains, something that integrates us into a larger, richer, deeper community than we could possibly enter onto our own. I think it would be a cruel irony if at the end of a long process of social and intellectual evolution, we produced a society that is suddenly incapable of real adaptation. Thank you.
So our second speaker this evening, thank you very much, is Micha Brumlik, who is Professor of Education at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And he was telling me before we kicked off the evening that he hadn't heard of us before, didn't know about this campus in Bard College Berlin, but we certainly had heard of him as he's one of the foremost figures in German intellectual life. And I think for many of us, although we're not his students, he's a teacher and guide to German history and culture through his writings on religion, his writings on Jewish history and culture in Germany, and of course his writings on education as well. And also through his articles in the Taz, for which I am a fanatical reader. And part of the reason that we invited him here this evening is because of an article that many of us read. Some of us who don't normally read the Taz also noticed it, because there was a big picture of the campus of Swarthmore College. One of our faculty members is a graduate of Swarthmore and has that strange devotion to institutions of the liberal arts that their various graduates seem to have, which also tells us something important about the value of the education they offer. So James noticed the picture of Swarthmore and the article, and it was very interesting for many reasons, also because, as I'm sure many of you know, American liberal arts education has played all kinds of roles in debates about education here in Germany. It's invoked in a very wide variety of ways as a good and bad model, and it was just very interesting to see this extremely reflective, thoughtful, and illuminating treatment of the topic, and also the framework in which it was placed in the Taz. So this was one reason why, among many, many others, why we thought that Professor Brumlik would be a provocative contributor to the discussion this evening. And we're extremely grateful and happy that he accepted our invitation. It's an honor to meet him, let alone to have the opportunity to hear him speak this evening. So please join me in welcoming him here.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, the honor is on my side. And since I agree with almost everything you said, I'll try to give another account, a very German account. And I follow immediately Professor Rommel with the concept of Bildung. But before I do this, I do have to confess that I still am under influence. Why? Because yesterday, don't be shocked, there was an asymmetry. I was on the Dorotheenstädtische Friedhof, and we were there because we celebrated the 200th day of the death of a German philosopher, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who died precisely 200 years ago, somehow infected by an infection his wife had while she was caring about German warriors against the French. However, why am I under influence? Because Johann Gottlieb Fichte was politically a highly ambivalent figure, was one of the Rektoren of the 1810 established Friedrich Wilhelm Universität. Here we might have a first disagreement. I don't like presidents. I'm still in favor of Rektoren, with a Latin word primi inter pares. I don't believe in those business administration types of university leaders. I think this is was one of the first wrong ways the German university did. I do not know that well the American university. So the German university in Berlin, Friedrich Wilhelm Universität, was established in 1810 after the defeat of Prussia against the French. And it was established as a means for inner reform of this society. And the first person who shaped it was Wilhelm von Humboldt, a man who was a linguist, a researcher, a humanist, and he was an individualist. In the sense you mentioned it, he said that every person should have the chance to develop all of its abilities proportionally, how he said it. Not for sure. I mean, we're in 1810, and this was a class society, so who went to this university? About 5,000 persons, mainly public servants, but they should have a broader education, a broader Bildung. Now, I tried to find translations for this German word Bildung, and I'm not sure whether it is exactly what one would understand with education in English. However, what I've found in philosophical handbooks and so on, the romantic program of Bildung, of aesthetic education, stressed the cultivation of love, the development of the capacity of every individual to give and receive affection. This was essential to self-realization, to the development of our humanity, the Romantics believed, because love is the very core of our humanity, the very center of our individuality. And another explanation of the concept of Bildung was this term might be translated as education, but it could also be rendered more appropriately in many contexts as formation, development, or even culture. So this was this very German concept of Bildung, and there were a lot of philosophers, amongst them Fichte I mentioned, who wrote between 1810 and 1813 concepts for this new university. And they all went back, now comes another philosopher of the Enlightenment, to a piece of Immanuel Kant, who wrote it in 1798, The Quarrel of the Faculties. And Kant in 1798 complained that philosophy and humanities were called the lower faculties, while professional school, medical school, and divinity school were called the higher faculties. Why though? What was it what Kant said? Well, divinity school, medical school, and law school only serve the needs of persons. Law school, the need as a member of an economic society of a state. Medical school, it's clear, the needs of the physical body, and divinity school, the needs of the soul if it's afraid, and so on. But what Kant said was, the lower, so-called lower faculties, they deal only with truth as a goal in itself. This might be a little bit different to the American tradition, that you have this idea of Bildung as a goal in itself, which does not serve any social, political, or economic needs or functions. Now, on this we should have another debate whether a society really can have something like this, which is declared a goal in itself. So why should taxpayers pay for something which does not have a political or an economic use or function? I think this is a point we do have to debate. Somehow I'm an old-fashioned professor, and I still think that this idea is the true idea of what a university or a liberal arts college should be. By the way, the name liberal arts college comes, as you all know, from the medieval universities, the artes liberales. And this brings me, we speak about Germany, to my next point, to Bologna. Bologna was the city of the first university in Europe after antiquity. And now, some 10 years ago, politicians from European countries had an agreement that university educations, university studies should be more regulated. Especially in Germany, one was afraid that students were too old before they would enter the world market of professionals or whatsoever. Others said, and there is a point in it, that students coming from so-called, I try to translate it, bildungsfernen Familien, you would say lower class families, which did not have educated parents, would do better if they had a strongly regulated curriculum. Because children from bildungsbürgerlichen Familien, families with an educational background, they could deal with all this irregulation, with all these unclear courses and so on, while the other students, they needed a strong regulation. Well, those were some of those arguments one had in the beginning, and another one was, and this really we have to debate as well, is that by now, and even 10 years ago, we had a growing number of young persons going to university. When I graduated from high school in 1967, we were 5% of a generation. Graduating from high school, going to university. Now today, 40 years later, it's 40 and soon will be 50%. So indeed, a society has a problem in dealing with this. So the answer was Bologna, which I criticized sharply. First of all, because I think this decision to regulate studies so that this is different to the United States. To have a BA, you must finish it within 3 years. And yeah,
It's not true.
it's not true. It's debated. This was a German. Okay, we debated the original agreement. However,
Every university could decide whether they
yeah,
want
but
to
what
introduce
happened
free association.
indeed, no, it's clear. But what happened indeed is different. The United States, as far as I know, I mean, regularly you may have a BA in 4 years. In Germany, the general expectation is that it would be in 3 years. And it was combined with the supposition, which is shown wrong, that the BA would be kind of a professional qualification. However, from my point of view, the worst consequence of Bologna is that the students, this is now a very German distinction, somehow were forced into the state of minds of pupils. At least I observed a loss of readiness for independent thinking. Being afraid that one couldn't have enough credit points, looking for strange excuses if one couldn't come to the course, a curriculum which had no freedom of time anymore, which touched the professors as well, by the way. The windows, the time windows when one had to give a course. I always provoked my dean by saying that this is against our constitution, Freiheit von Forschung und Lehre. Nothing is written, I mean, that you have to give your course introduction to whatsoever Tuesday 2 to 4. I mean, those were problems, however, but the main problem is that I really think, and I would think that we could show this by empirical research as well, is that a certain attitude of independent thinking, speculating, debating now is lost. What young persons at the university are striving for is that they may have their credit points at time. This does not mean that there are not still enough who do think independently, but I think tendency it is diminishing. And this goes hand in hand with this very strange development of competitive business administration of universities, as were universities factories for producing buttons or something like this, on the one hand. And on the other side, they organize themselves according to a model which historically definitely failed, namely planned economy, Planwirtschaft. The Module, and this is Planwirtschaft. It is not looked for what students would like to choose which course they would take, but what they do have to take. I call this Planwirtschaft. It doesn't work. So there is no match between the need and interest of the students and of what professors and teachers offer. Now you see, I complain that too much of business administration thinking entered the university, and this does not touch only the students, but young scientists and scholars in humanity as well. I mean, I somehow grew up as a professor in a gold digger time. And when I was 27, I knew I could stay for the rest of my life at the university. Unbefristeter Vertrag. Now today, look for young scholars and scientists. They do have contracts 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And there is an idea behind it that people under stress would be more productive. This is a psychological question. I do not believe this. I think you need, this again is one of those humanistic terms, Greek, scolaire, Muße, I don't know how to translate it. Was it Muße in English? Leisure time? No. Leisure time?
modern times, quality time.
It's quality time somehow. Yeah.
Seriously.
And a university which is ruled and governed by a business administration model, with short contract working places, I'm sure that even productivity cannot develop. That means, and I'll come to an end, the problem is that presently more than ever, education is becoming a commodity. And by this, I learned this in the United States. Thanks for this, you invited me. I was in Dartmouth College in the summer. It was fantastic. I had with another colleague, it was a course about psychoanalysis, 5 students. And in the other course, as well with a colleague about German Jewish history, where we were 14. It was like a dream compared with what happened in Germany in the last 20, 30 years. But then I asked a little bit, well, so how do you come here and why? And what do you pay? A yearly tuition of $46,000 without food and housing. I couldn't believe it, but then I went to Barnes & Noble and bought this book. The Best Value Colleges, 2013 edition by the Princeton Review. Where to get your higher education at a great price. And if you open this, for example, Amherst, you have precisely tables, bang for your buck, where you have all the statistics you need, including the financial facts, financial aid rating, and at the bottom, the average cumulative indebtedness you have after study. Now, this is strange. I mean, in Germany, this is a political issue. And those state governments who only thought that one should have a little bit higher tuitions than 150 euro by a semester, they simply were striked away at elections. This does not work. Now, this is decided. This does not mean that Germany is not as well a class society, as well not in universities and colleges. We may debate it. This is the one conflict. And the other conflict we now have in one of the biggest states of Germany, North Rhine-Westphalen. Some years ago they had a Hochschulfreiheitsgesetz, a law concerning the freedom of the universities, which meant again that the universities could decide more independently from the state how their curricula should be, and especially where their fundings would come from. And here's another problem. Here's another problem. I know it from my former university, University of Frankfurt, the problem of the influence of the economy to the university. That is, it's difficult to translate, that if banks or other firms are financing for a certain time a chair, then they do have influence what will be taught there. For example, in Frankfurt, more and more in the business administration, it's a house of law and finance. Strange enough, I mean, that in Germany it has an English name, but again, you have nationalist argument, I mean, for House of Law and Finance, which is financed by the banks in Frankfurt. And again, I think here you have a strong, not really democratically controlled influence of the economy to academia, which I think very critical of. Okay, so far, I mean, if I would say what my idea of education would be as well, then I would say with Martha Nussbaum, who wrote 10 years ago a book, Cultivating Humanity, a classical defense of reform in liberal education. And education is truly, as she writes, fitted for freedom, only if it is such as to produce free citizens, citizens who are free not because of wealth or birth, but because they can call their minds their own. This is Bildung als Selbstzweck, education as a goal in itself. And I would add, today, in the age of globalization, we should accomplish this by saying that we need there an education for global citizens. We need a cosmopolitan education, eine weltbürgerliche Bildung. Thanks for your attention.
Where do we start? I guess I mean, I think the economic question looms over everything we both said in various ways, and I think we have to sort of tackle it maybe in different, in its different elements. The first question I would pose is to Geoffrey Harpham, bringing up what talked about, which is, I guess, an issue that has come up for all of us in various ways, which I suppose could be summed up with the category of utility. How do you actually, what role does that category play in thinking about liberal arts education? And I suppose what I'm wondering is whether it's a real difference or whether it's a purely strategic difference to talk about Bildung as something, as an end in itself, or to make the argument that you were presenting, which is to say that you can't have quality in anything else, even quality of life, if you don't have good quality education, which has this freedom that Professor Brumlik was evoking. I guess I'm just wondering whether that is a genuine division between the two positions, or whether it's a matter of simply how one puts it, because it sounded as though you were presenting this as, in a sense, an argument with those who would reject the value of this kind of education. But is it actually a distinct position from the position that this type of education is an end in itself?
Well, that's a deep question. I would say that it's more than a tactical or strategic decision. I'd say it's a very fundamental principle. It's very striking to me as I look at American education and educational systems elsewhere, that the American system of education was derived pretty consciously from political and from moral commitments. As those commitments came first. We have a democracy. Democracy represents a problem that only education can solve. How are people going to contribute to their own governance? First of all, they have to be self-governing. And from this basic insight, the educational system and all of its ramifications flowed. And I think it's a very real difference between a system formed on that basis and a system formed as a response to the question, what do the professions need? You know, what sort of employees do we need today to fill the jobs that we have for now and the immediate future? I think that those will produce two very, very different systems, and ultimately I think they'll produce two very, very different societies. And in the United States today, I'm very concerned because I see the second argument, what are our current economic needs, framing all the discussion about education, when I think the discussion ought to begin with, what sort of society do we have here? What sort of people do we want to be? I think that should be the basis for our thinking. So I don't think it's merely a rhetorical decision that we have to make. I think it's a decision about what our values really are, what we want here, what we're trying to do.
But I mean, I think everyone can clearly see the sort of dangers of educating for the professions, right?
Oh,
That
no.
education,
Yeah,
well,
I
I
think
mean,
that's
in
wrong.
this room at least, that to sort of instrumentalize the system in that way is going to produce certain results, you know, that there's going to be this program and that program directed to that profession or that job. But I suppose I'm wondering, and this is maybe a question for you also, whether there has ever been an education that is not tied to some sort of social function. I mean, even the German Bildungsideal is, you know, it's historically linked with the formation of a civil service, of a bureaucratic class. I mean, can we really say that education is ever fully autonomous of those kinds of needs? Or shouldn't we rather say that there are different sort of historically different formations, that sometimes we see greater or lesser degrees of instrumentalization? In the sort of historical case of Bildung, we see an immense sort of freedom and excess over the needs of the state that produced a wonderful philosophical tradition and the idea that you've been evoking, but it wasn't wholly separate from the needs of the economy of the society. I'm just wondering, you know, are we talking about degrees of autonomy rather than an ideal versus an instrumental reality or set of instrumental needs?
No, this is absolutely true. I mean, if we have a realistic sociological perspective, then for sure, even institutions of higher education which claim that they only are striving for truth, I mean, do have a certain and a very important social function. But on the other hand, to say we only can explain it to our taxpayers if we make clear that all of this will contribute to, let us say, a better professional success. So this is wrong. I think even for a democratic society, it is important to have spaces where questions of truth can be debated. Not asking whether, and here I'm again with Kant, Streiter Fakultäten, whether they would fulfill the needs of the body, of the soul, or of the civic status of a person.
Yeah, I think that's...
And maybe one other point would be a question for you. I mean, I do not know though the history of American institutions of higher education so well, but was it really the case that right from the beginning the core idea was education for democracy? I mean, all those divinity schools, Dartmouth, for example,
it was not
which I accidentally know.
Not only Dartmouth, it was not the case that from the beginning the idea was education for democracy. You're right to point to the religious origins of most institutions of higher learning in America and through up well into the 20th century. Many institutions that we now think of as thoroughly secular had a religious affiliation at the very least. And to answer your question, it has never been the case that education in America or probably any place else in this universe has been conceived of as a kind of little bubble, magically exempt from all the pressures that affect the real world. There's always been a tension between worldliness and the slight otherworldliness of the educational process. 100 years ago, I think most of the institutions, most of the well-known, well-established institutions of higher education thought that they were creating this charmed space for the future leaders of the society. And they directed their programs specifically towards those higher civic virtues that would be expected of a leader of society, opinion leaders, thought leaders, financial leaders, any kind of leadership position. You should be expected to know what that Greek sentence says up there and to be able to quote Phaedrus at length in detail. But after the Second World War, this is the kind of magic moment in American educational history. Some of the same features of that concept of education as charmed space where the intellect luxuriates in freedom were translated into a democratic principle of universal education. And it was thought for a little while that you could that you could spread this concept out globally, and you could have a system that would apply both to secondary and post-secondary education that would inculcate freedom. And it was thought at that time, and maybe they were thinking from a position of immense financial and indeed military security at that time. It was thought that the country could well afford this, and it would be in accord with the basic ideas of the country. I think this lasted for about 25 or 30 years. Maybe it didn't outlast the 60s. And in fact, maybe the kind of counterculture and the student demonstrations and the turbulence about Vietnam and everything just shattered the idea that you could have a common culture, and also shattered the idea that universities were spaces of freedom untouched by the world. They were very touched by the world and sought to touch it in return. And since then, we've been struggling in our own way and in our own generation with this constant tension between the ideal conception of education and more worldly, materialistic, real world considerations.
I suppose what I'm trying to kind of probe is whether we might be accused of being in a way nostalgic for an earlier phase of educational goals, whether and how exactly we articulate this ideal in an effective way, because it sounds as if, especially from what you were describing, what the system, as it were, needs today is for people to serve a function, slotting them in a very kind of instrumentalizing way. And you're seeing that, you say, in attitudes, in the whole sort of operation of the university system. But in sort of practical terms, what are the spaces or the possibilities that you see for actually for bringing this ideal to life? I mean, we can say that it's what we're committed to, but what are the sort of openings that give it some sort of potential to actually be actual for students, say?
Well, what I hope is that the strict system of Bologna will be changed step by step as it was already. I mean, at the beginning, we really had to check whether students would be in the lecture or the seminary every week. This somehow was not feasible, at least not in Frankfurt. Then there was a debate whether it would be better to have it, the BA, in 3 years or in 4 years. Then one did ask whether this system really would challenge students to go abroad to gain a cosmopolitan knowledge, and it didn't work. So many of the promises of Bologna simply did not work. And so I think by and by it will be changed, and there might be go half a way to what has been before. And what is now interesting, and with this political conflict in Nordrhein-Westfalen, Hochschulfreiheitsgesetz, and it's changing whether really universities should be run like companies with a corporate identity. I think this is not what science should be organized like. It's simply, in philosophy we would say, a categorical mistake and Kategorienfehler. Universities are no factories, and no factories of knowledge. And they even are not banks for human capital. The core of the idea of the university is a question of truth and freedom. And I mean, this is the heritage of this German university, which, and here we have another story in Germany than in the United States. I mean, the sad fact is that this idea of the university failed horribly in the time of National Socialism, no doubt. And afterwards it had to be rebuilt anew. This is what happened in the late 60s, where the free speech movement and other things in the United States. But then, again, my complaint, the managerial approach came, and I think that this was a practical and categorical mistake.
Now, you raised the issue of nostalgia, and humanists are very sensitive to this issue because they're so heavily invested in the past, they're always vulnerable to the accusation of nostalgia. But I'll tell you what I'm nostalgic for, or maybe nostalgia isn't quite the right. I'll tell you a little story. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk at Washington University in St. Louis, and after the talk, an elderly man, white hair, approached me, big smile on his face, and he said, "I want to tell you my story," which sometimes happens after you give a talk. Didn't want to talk about anything that I was discussing at all, but he wanted to tell me his story. And while everybody else was gathered around waiting, he told it. He was some 50 years before a refugee from Cuba. He literally washed up on the shore, as he said. Everybody else in the boat drowned. He swam ashore the last couple of miles and found himself in Florida with no money, no English language, no clothes, no friends, no relatives, nothing, as destitute as a body could be, and a teenager. No relevant education either. And after a couple of years, he was in a position so that he thought he could better himself somehow. So he went to a community college, which is an institution that arose in great numbers after the end of the Second War, basically in the 1950s, to accommodate people who wanted post-secondary education but weren't ready to go to a four-year school. So he found himself in a community college, and this community college had an academic program. It wasn't just teaching him how to thread pipe or be a house painter or something like that. It was not just vocational. It had an academic component. This academic component had a humanistic dimension, and so he found himself in a world literature class where he was reading Shakespeare. He had no understanding of Shakespeare whatsoever. This is not the language he was hearing on the streets. And so he just sat there with his face in his book at the back of the class and tried to escape notice. But one day the teacher came up to him, as he told me, and he said, "Mr. Ramirez, what do you think?" And as he said, I just looked up at him helplessly. I had no thoughts, nothing. I had nothing. He said, "But I've always remembered this moment because it was the first time that anybody had ever asked me that question." And he said, "And that's my story." And he gave me his business card and left, and I dealt with the other people around. And after the room cleared, I took his card out, and he was an emeritus professor of comparative literature. And there are lots of elements in this story that I think are so heartwarming. First of all, the country took him in, even though he had no passport, no nothing, somehow. Now maybe his being from Cuba assisted in that. But then he was given an educational opportunity, not just a high school, but post-secondary educational opportunity. That educational opportunity had an academic component. It wasn't just a vocational school. The academic component had a humanities dimension, which exposed him to the highest point that human culture has attained, Shakespeare. Whether you can understand it or not, you lowly worm, you have the right to have access to the best that world culture has to offer. And not only that, but your opinion counts. What do you think? In other words, we're not just teaching you about Shakespeare. I want to hear what you think, no matter how little you think. And even though he had nothing on his mind except, how do I get out of this room? That question, in his account at least, proved to be transformative. The first time anybody ever asked me that question. And at least in his retrospective account, he's obviously a very unusual person and would have made his way somehow, anywhere. But at least in his account, it was that kind of interest that the educational system took in him and that the society took to give him that educational opportunity that enabled him to find his level in the world. I'm very nostalgic for that. And when I hear people say that we should train for the jobs that currently exist, or we should train to make the nation competitive, or everybody should be studying computer science, everybody should become an entrepreneur in a strictly business sense, I think of all the wasted lives that would create. People who have no aptitude, interest, and all the other faculties that the society really needs that would languish for lack of development. That's what I'm nostalgic for, and I hope that I don't turn out to be nostalgic for it, because I hope that we continue to produce people like that.
I guess I have one final question before the audience should get a chance.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, just as a clarification, also from the story you've just told, how seriously you each take this this issue that you mentioned with respect to Bologna in its introduction, the idea of a common culture, that's often raised as a problem that makes the sort of liberal arts education that one might be nostalgic for in some way problematic, right? The idea that we shouldn't assume that we should be teaching Shakespeare. We need to sort of, democratization is associated with a certain sort of functionality that we don't draw on the sort of Western canon or something of the sort, because people have different levels of relationship to that. And I felt in your evocation of Bologna, you didn't sort of think that was an argument for why it ought to have been introduced, the class argument that students are coming in with different degrees of familiarity with the sort of texts that their professors would like them to know about. And this initiative was in part an attempt to kind of systematize what they would absorb and make sure that everyone's sort of on the same level. I'm just wondering how much of an issue is this, and in what precise way is it an issue now, the question of a common culture? I mean, it sounds as though in what you just talked about, it's more important to have the process of being exposed to something, being asked what one's response is, and that we shouldn't worry about it being the starting point being one of extreme disorientation sometimes, that somebody might not really have a foothold in that situation. But I mean, of course, many people would worry about that as an issue in class terms, in cultural terms, and so on. So, I mean, you probably have very different things to say about this.
Well, this is a question of the methods and the method of teaching. And whether we would have the means at the universities to do so. I am convinced if we had more professors and more assistants and more tutors and mentors and so on, we even in small groups could give those so-called children from bildungsfernen Schichten an education, eine Bildung, which would qualify as well the children from bildungsbürgerlichen Familien. But now this is really the question, what is a society ready to pay for this education of its citizens? This is a political dispute, and the strange thing, at least we have it in Germany, I don't know how it is in the States of the United States, everybody says of the politicians, how important education is, but if you really look to the budgets they try to make in the parliament at the end, this rhetoric somehow really is refuted. I mean, it's simply, in Germany you would say, Sonntagsreden.
That's not true.
Doch. Viel zu wenig Geld für Bildung.
But we have an increase of the higher education, of the money invested in higher education over the last 10 years. This is the highest budget of the Ministry of Education and Research in Germany we ever had.
This is right, but it's not appropriate, to the highest degree of students we have. That's a statistical problem. I mean, what do you compare? Excuse me.
Questions?
Yeah.
I have it, please.
I think you both are right in your analysis, but we didn't discuss what is the meaning still and the importance of the citizens. I can tell you, when we try to make changes in our school system, in our educational system, they had a strict no from the so-called well-educated, well-situated citizens. I can give you examples from several cities. It's my first question. And I remember when the Bologna process was decided, I didn't hear big manifestations. I didn't see them even from the professors. And in the beginning, neither from the students. It took a long time. The only big move was coming from students, bringing this first steps of changes we have. And I think what we have to discuss, how can we change the minds, which kind of education we need. When you go today in German universities, the majority is not thinking about Bildung. Even to be a citizen with democratic rights and duties, it's out. It's no philosophy, very little. It's not obligatory, and it is necessary as well within the humanities, but especially in natural sciences and engineering. Because there you have the question, as you said, you need more interdisciplinarity, different thinking, and what was said at the end. There we have to change a lot. At the moment, I learn more in the Asian regions of our world than in Europe. And I think this homo economicus, that is a reduction of human abilities, that finally will weaken economy too. Because you need this kind of, I follow a lot of Socrates. There you have this thinking, reflecting, discussing. Perhaps you are right or the other is right. That's for me at the same time an approach to learn, how to learn, and to learn all life long. But on the other side, it's a democratic approach. It takes a lot of efforts, but nowadays our universities don't ask for education, but for excellency in the main topics of our different sciences branches. So what can be done to bring the ideas from both of you within a broader public at the moment? Because you know it's important to have more money, but you have to combine money and good thinking. Without ideas and good thinking within the whole society, you will not progress. So I ask you, what can be done? It's a good analysis from both of you, but how to react to it? It's not only the politicians, there is a broader sense in the society, and we have already a very split society, with a lot of poverty in our so good welfare states, as we believe.
Okay. Well, I mean, my answer would be first, I mean, to cut the influence of the economy to the universities, and within the universities to give more freedom for thinking. And well, in fact, I mean, if it's only a discussion of something like this, then give credit points for discussion, and not only that somebody quickly writes a paper or a PowerPoint presentation. Those were very small steps. But I really think it is important to cut or to shorten the influence of the economy, and therefore we spoke about Nordrhein-Westfalen. I'm definitely in favor of finishing the Hochschulräte, and we need the old aristocratic association of professors. I mean, this is good enough.
I've seen you all, but there's a man in the third row.
Yeah, the discussion was somehow focused on this alternative of, say, liberal arts or liberal arts college, general education versus professional vocational education. And I simply want to make one point that what Bildung meant in the German tradition is completely different from both of these traditions. I think that's an important point, because when Bildung arises at the end of the 18th century, it's clearly a translation from English. It comes from Shaftesbury. It's self-cultivation. It's a German translation of the English self-cultivation. But it has no connection at all to what the liberal arts tradition means, because from its beginning it's closely tied to ideas about focusing, specialization, concentration on only one subject of study. And by focusing on only one, it doesn't matter so much which subject of study. It can be classical philology or physics, it doesn't matter. But it has to be only one. And you have to focus on this only one subject of study and explore it from all angles. And by this process of exploration, you really reconstitute the world from one subject of study. And that's completely different from the liberal arts tradition. And I think it's important to see this, because these are still two alternatives. And you mentioned Veblen, and he, of course, it's rarely read today, this higher education in America. But you cited this polemics against the economic spirit, the businessmen. But in Veblen meant the liberal arts college, which he understood as a kind of realization of a shallow approach to many subjects, which is addressed to persons who are not really interested in anything at all. And he clearly still hoped that the liberal arts college will disappear from America, and that the research university, which is tied to this German idea of self-cultivation, will be the dominating American higher educational institution. But that's, this didn't happen, we all know this. But it's remarkable that it could be seen at this point of time in this way. But what is important, I think, in a systematic way, that these are still two completely different and completely contemporary ideas of education. And one should not try to effect a fusion. They're different.
There's still a tension, very much alive and well, between the idea of focusing your thought and exploring a single perspective fully from within, and the interdisciplinary approach that has porous boundaries between the various fields, and the dominant tendency, that is the emergent tendency today, is towards interdisciplinarity, and it has been for a generation. I'm actually a bit skeptical of this, although I've done a great deal of interdisciplinary work myself. I believe in the disciplines. Disciplines are very important because they recognize human finitude. They recognize that human understanding flourishes within constraints. And that if you remove constraints, you're likely to think about nothing whatsoever, nothing in a very productive way, certainly. And I often find myself on the wrong or losing side of debates about interdisciplinarity versus disciplinarity when I say that the disciplines are absolutely crucial because they give thought what integrity it has, what structure it has, what limits it has. And interdisciplinarity has many appeals, but it has many dangers as well. Too often today, I think people think that real productive creative thought emerges only in those interstices between the disciplines. I don't believe that. I think sometimes it does, but I think, I can think of dozens of examples of great scholars who have revolutionized their discipline from within. Erich Auerbach never stopped being a philologist, but he revolutionized the field of philology and gave birth to comparative literature by virtue of his work. Stephen Greenblatt, who we both know, has always been a Renaissance literary scholar, but he's revolutionized the study, not just of Renaissance literature, but the study of literature by inhabiting it so fully, but in such a dynamic way, that it and adjacent fields are changed as well. So I think that the disciplines have a lot to be said for them, and they need defenders in this very interdisciplinary age.
The subject was education and engagement. when I listen to Harpham, I see some ways of making the difference. This I should teach and this I should not teach. This should be education and it should not be, because you have a certain idea about what you would like the education to serve for. If I take your way of talking about Bildung, which is not the way I would understand it, I don't see the difference. And that is why, what is your criterion? If you mention the Bologna process, I think I have a completely different image. If you read the texts when the Bologna process was initiated, they are wonderful.
Yeah.
They are even more beautiful than you are talking about Bildung. The mistake was not the idea. The mistake was first to try to do it on the level of the European Union, on such a general level. Second, to do it with the continental European universities, which are not universities listening to the students or being interested in the students, but they are universities of professors. So what really happened was that there was a scheme given, and every professor said, well, what I teach has to be part of the curriculum. So everything was squeezed, and the result was that the students were confronted with the traditional structure as the professors would like to give their interests into the study. So, and there are a lot of other, then we have these agencies and so on. There are a lot of other elements which made out of this wonderful Bologna Declaration a kind of straitjacket now for our students, which don't allow them to ask a question or to be asked, what do you think? But isn't it also due to these kind of professors who just say we would like to give Bildung, instead of answering the question, what would you like what would you like the education to be? They had ample of opportunities. They are dominating the university. They had ample opportunities to make liberal arts college ideas within the university, within the Bologna process. They didn't. So my question is, what does it mean when you talk about Bildung?
Well, you asked at the beginning that we should talk about education and engagement. And again, the nostalgic argument would be if students in the institutions of higher education even do not have the occasion, the place and the time to engage intellectually, then I think they will not engage politically or socially or however. Political and social engagement often, not always, begins at least at the university with intellectual engagement. And within real existierende Bologna, you're absolutely right about the papers at the beginning. Within real existierende Bologna, there simply is no space for intellectual independent engagement. Now you could ask me what I did. I cheated. I wrote something into the Modulhandbuch and I did something else, which somehow was appropriate to what I think what education Bildung would be. And I think I'm not the only one who does so.
Don't get any ideas.
And I mean, no, we could have a debated historical case. In 1967, we had Student und Politik by Ludwig von Fredeburg and others, and I mean, so this was written out of the experience of the reactionary Ordinarien Universität, and there was no prognostics at all that things would change, and just a year later, as well induced by international developments, we had the student revolt, which for sure was ambivalent as well. but it has shown at least what I think, that even in this reactionary Ordinarium Universität, there was more place and time for intellectual independence and engagement, and this we do have to regain.
You've been waiting for questions.
I would like to follow up on the point that Joachim Nettelbeck mentioned when he said that the German university is constituted not as a university of the students but of professors. And I think there's a fundamental difference between a German understanding and an American understanding that creates a problem of translation. We are talking about higher education, but I remember a discussion with a lot of German university professors where Rudolf Stichwey was participating and describing the German university as a bastard between education and research, or science, the scientific system. And there was an outcry of the German professors. They all said, we are not in the business of education. Education is something that school has to provide. Once they enter university, it's about research. So they said, in German, Erziehung is nothing that is done at the university. And they try to produce, specialists who are fit to conduct research. And therefore, the idea that the German university is about education is nothing that a majority of German professors would agree to. And this produces some conflicts that are, accelerated by the Bologna process in the way that Joachim Nettelbeck just described. Once they are forced to confront themselves with mass higher education, then the problems arise.
I mean, the official logo was Einheit von Forschung und Lehre. Indeed, Bildung, Lehre was not education im Sinne von Erziehung, because Erziehung is a process which does not give too many Spielräume, spaces of freedom for those to be educated.
Okay, but then we have
and students somehow are adults. They are not to be educated, but they should be taught unity of research and teaching, academic teaching.
The immense contribution of the German Research University was to, in the 19th century especially, was to demonstrate that you could concentrate research in an institution and accelerate it dramatically. At the same time, John Henry Newman was writing The Idea of the University in England, and the first sentence of that book was, the university is dedicated to the transmission of knowledge and not the creation of it. He was dead set against research as a function of the university at all. And this prejudice continued well into the 20th century in many British universities and many American universities. I don't think that Harvard University committed itself to research until the 1950s, nor did Princeton. There were a number of very distinguished universities that were basically institutions that formed the socially, that formed the children of the then ruling class and perpetuated that class's dominance, but were not dedicated to research. When the American government decided in about 1950 to devote itself to funding scientific research through universities, rather than through the Department of Defense or Bell Labs or someplace like this, billions of dollars were sent to universities for research, and this had a transformative effect on the American university system. All the universities that were not hitherto research universities became research universities because they had to, in order to compete with the ones that were. This had, and I'm getting a little away from your question now, but it's so interesting, this had a transformative effect on the humanities, because the humanities were the area in the United States where teaching was thought to be most important. The humanities was where you had this kind of inspiration factor, the great teacher and the student ready to learn. And that's where you have somebody saying, "What's your opinion, Mr. Ramirez or Mr. whatever the name is?" And when the humanities found itself in this new research environment about 60 or so years ago, they too had to become research disciplines. And this really tore the humanities apart. But over time, the research function overpowered the teaching function because all the professional incentives were in the direction of research. You got paid, you got promoted, your reputation was based on your research, not on your teaching. And this, I think, deformed the humanities professions, which are and ought to be centrally concerned with teaching, with the teacher-student relationship, and we're still struggling with this today.
Lucas, you had a question?
So, well, thank you both. I just wanted to ask regarding the idea of participation. I think that's a funny notion. Also, just concerning the whole notion of engagement. You both talk about it. You both seem very keen on that students should be active, transformative agents in their own education, and they should think. As you just said about your very good American story about the man staying on the beach and getting an education.
Didn't get his education on the beach, though.
That would be even better, though.
Yeah.
But he was asked, what do you think, right? This question. So I'd like to bring up something you said, that the number of students have increased from what? In America, I know it's from 15 to over 50% now. People receiving degrees. It's way over.
Yes.
This is also a problem that Drew Foss, president of the Harvard, also brought up in an article from 2007, which I think is very relevant discussing. Because how do we get students to participate if there are 200 or 300 people in class? How do you ask? Do you want the teacher to walk around asking, what do you think? Do we make more universities? Do we hire more teachers? I mean, what would be a concrete solution for that? Or should we just give up and say, well, we have a group of universities dedicated to humanities where people can come to think, and then we have other universities where we just educate the people who need to crunch the numbers, because we also need someone to crunch the numbers.
Well, I'll take that one first. Bard College is an especially good example of a learning environment dedicated to the small group. I went to Northwestern University, which is quite a good university, but they are well known for having large classes. And while I think maybe many of my fellow students kind of languished in these large classes, I absolutely love them. I loved the big lecture classes where you'd have 300 people because they seemed like public events. They were generally taught by very charismatic professors. And I didn't want to hear myself talk or my fellow students talk. I wanted to hear Eric Heller or Stephen Spender or Richard Ellman or the great figures that the university had to offer talk. As I said, many of my fellow students didn't have this patience for the 50-minute lecture with no questions, but I don't think it's absolutely useless as a pedagogical tool. I think in small quantities, I think it can be quite inspiring and give you a sense of moment and a sense of magnitude beyond what the small seminar can give you.
So I'm an American student. I kind of also spent some time doing a little homestay and kind of going to a French high school for a little bit too. And I see the differences between our systems, and I know in France they kind of divide before high school for a technical school and the lycée, people are going to go on to university. But I think that before university is where we're starting to hit these problems already, because I know this, I wasn't having my first experience with an immersive and exploratory education until I took an IB class, and it was write an external assessment on something that you care about. And
what's an IB class?
International Baccalaureate.
Okay. All right.
And then that wasn't until I was kind of equipped to understand that I could have my own. And in the same sense that you're saying that, yes, some people, like you thrived in a larger classroom setting, how can we instill upon, I think it comes down to kind of instilling some of these values in our primary education, because if students can't understand what kind of student they are because they're being prepared for a test or something like that, I think it goes down to kind of introducing this kind of broad spectrum like the International Baccalaureate of exploring lots of fields, introducing this component of an opinion without realizing that you have your own opinion. How can you start to question yourself, understand yourself as a student? And I feel, even going home over your Christmas, I spoke with a lot of my friends who are now going through American educational systems right now, and how different our educations are right now, and that I still see many people shackled by a high school education that they had, or a way that they were treated within their primary education that has now defined them as a student for the rest of their life.
at every level of education, the teachers complain about the poverty of the preparation of their students to prior level. At every level of education, you know, the pre-K did not do its job, or the kindergartners I'm getting are so.
And at all ages.
What?
And at all ages.
At all ages. One thing I think we have to accept is that education is always going to fall short of its goals. It will always fail in some respect or other. And what we hope to do is to minimize those failures, maximize its successes, but we have to resign ourselves to the fact that preparation is always going to be inadequate. You're always going to have to do remediation. You'll never reach the goal of a completely self-realized, well-rounded person, and you should just get used to it.
But how then can we re-stimulate, I'm just wondering from your perspective, how we can re-stimulate and equip people with more of these ideals of a humanistic education, in the sense of how can we make people know that they have an opinion? How can we make people realize, I mean, I know that sounds, make people, it sounds very forceful, but how can we make people more aware that the dynamics of every situation? I think there needs to be an implementation or introduction that these fields do intersect. I mean, I actually just had at the Citizen Science program at Bard College an interesting idea of a person who understood and is trying to use military tactics to understand how to combat HIV. You know, crossing these fields, how do we, you know, stuff like that, how do we start to equip the students with the idea that what they say matters, and that, you know, like I just feel that many students become lost. Their opinion
I
becomes
don't know
lost.
if I have a general answer to that question. It sounds though your education has already given you some opportunities in this, of this kind.
I have a question directly for Professor Brumlik, I guess, because at the end of your statement, I believe that you call for globally aware students. And for me, global awareness, I think it means that opening up and also understanding different cultures and paradigms. And I was wondering how you suggest that we would do that if you have no like proper understanding of your own like intellectual legacy, or like if you don't engage with that in your education, then how are you going to reach?
I mean, definitely you need both, but since the colleague at the beginning said there is a little bit problem since since at least in the United States there is no consensus anymore about the cultural basics, so I definitely would give in that you do have to become aware of your own intellectual, moral and ethical tradition. But I really do think in the globalized world it is necessary, and you cannot reach everything, that you, at least a beginning understanding how life, feeling and ethics in other cultures is like. And I think this is what I read at least by Martha Nussbaum, you can do already in a liberal arts BA course. It will not be a full understanding of, let us say, an East Asian culture, but some basic features. I think this is necessary, and I even do think that it is necessary that students should know a second language to the one they grew up in.
As a labor economist, I would like to come to the same conclusion that I think was your main conclusion, but from a different angle. I think labor economics and labor research shows very nicely that the two rationales of education that you have outlined, the tension between them is actually decreasing, because the labor market requires qualifications that are qualifications that you get from liberal arts education. Adaptability, flexibility, the ability to step back and look at things from a wider angle, and so on. So I think the tension is decreasing, and then of course the question arises, well, why is the Bologna process going into the opposite direction? And I would very strongly argue against your view that it's all bureaucratic regulation coming from the top. And I would very much like to argue together with the two gentlemen in front that it's the German universities who, by implementing Bologna, have failed. I mean, what we have done is nothing that has been that we have forced to be doing. And Bologna says nothing about a bachelor in 3 years. Nothing. Bologna doesn't say anything about checking whether students are present or not. Nothing like that. It's I very much like the view of that was presented about the German university being a university of professors. It's the interest of the professors that has made Bologna what it is. If research is your main focus, well then of course you would like, if you have to teach, then you're more interested in teaching in a master's course than you are teaching in a bachelor's course. So in order to gain more weight for master's courses, you reduce the bachelor's courses to 3 years, and so on. So I think it's not really fair to blame Bologna and the European process. It's fair to blame the universities, the German universities, and implement.
Just one point. I mean, I spoke about the real existierendes Bologna, not about the papers which were written. And I would give in that we, the professors at the beginning, disliked the whole thing, that we really did not take care of it. I would give in. But as well, politics put the wrong incentives. This is what Mrs. Sismod has said. I mean, with those excellence competitions and so on, it somehow, paid especially those who did not want to teach their students, but simply wanted to sit in the laboratory or to write their next Mittelantrag. So you could say it was a responsibility of politics and a part of the professors of the university.
The timekeepers are giving me dirty looks. I think we're going to have to soon bow to the varying constraints here, but maybe Linda, you could say what you want to say, and Martina.
Just a very quick question. Professor Harpham, you argued that disciplines need defenders, and you said that interdisciplinarity is dangerous. But could you please explain why that is, and whether we should worry about it?
I don't think I actually said that it was dangerous. I said that it was not the answer to all questions, and it was not going to save us. It was not the unqualified good that it's often made out to be. And I'm skeptical of the very considerable claims that are often made on its behalf. I think it can be valuable. Really, my own personal career has been relentlessly interdisciplinary without thinking much about it. I just wanted to stand up as perhaps a lonely voice for the disciplines themselves, which I think are the condition of interdisciplinarity. They're not the enemy of interdisciplinarity. They're the condition of interdisciplinarity. And I think that an uncritical, unprepared interdisciplinarity is likely to reproduce the already known or the obvious and be unaware of its banality. That's the worst case for interdisciplinarity. I just don't think it should be fetishized or held up as the goal of all education, as though the disciplines themselves were the enemies. I don't think that's the case.
Maybe I'm the last one to speak tonight, I don't know, at least in this setting, but amidst all the problems that we've discussed, I do see a lot of good coming out of the European process and the Bologna process, and that you see in the classroom. When I was a student and I studied at Mainz University, we had students from the Pfalz, from Hessen, from Westerwald, and it was very regional, right? Go into the classrooms today, you have a Spanish student sitting next to a Polish student, a German student. The landscape in the classroom has changed completely due to the Bologna process, due to the European Union idea. And that shapes education just as much as the content that's being discussed. So having these young people work together on whatever subject changes them and changes the way they look at the world and themselves. So in a way, the cosmopolitan education is taking place in our classrooms, and that I just wanted to add as a positive note to the discussion.
Yeah, and I'd say too that, I mean, for us as a relatively new institution, these regulations have been in many ways very helpful, but of course it's how you actually implement them. It's interesting to think about these sort of laboratories in a sense of cross-cultural exchange, because increasingly we have the choice what traditions to follow. We aren't just slotted in straight away, and we have the question of how to actually internationalize effectively and address the needs of students who are coming from different backgrounds. I guess, I mean, you both addressed huge questions, and it's really, I suppose, what it comes down to in a sense is the question of how to preserve and nurture the ideal of freedom that you've evoked, exactly what we do about the sorts of issues you were raising, or about responding to the arguments that are made against this type of education. And then, of course, the much more contentious question that's come up, which is freedom for whom exactly, who is benefited by previous phases of the educational system and the forms that it's had in different contexts. And also now, what exactly is the educational context is what you evoked at the very end. How do we conceive of it at all, given that it is transnational, and it does raise the possibility that we're not solely in the German tradition or solely in the American tradition, or that, as here, the students will be coming from high schools all around the world and going to college in a different tradition from the one that they know from their own country. So our guests should now have some well-deserved refreshment, and I thank them very much again, and also